everybody. Today we're starting a new unit, which is all about land resources and land use. And you can see all of the different chapters that are going to be involved in this unit that all revolve around these things that have to do with the land. And after this should take us to about spring break, and then when we come back, we'll be starting air and energy, which would be our air pollution and our different forms of renewable, non-renewable energy. So you can see that soils are very heavily involved in this unit, and also just the ways that we use land for different resources. So let's start talking about those land resources, and you've already taken some notes on this also. So forests you looked into quite a bit last night, and we'll talk about more today. Rangelands are very important to know about, and that might be a new term to you. So wherever we see these orange words, these are things that you'd probably need to define in your notes. So rangeland is a grassland, and it's usually either a temperate grassland or tropical grassland, but in either case what makes it special is it's an important area where we produce food by raising livestock. So things like cattle, sheep, and goats basically graze on this land. And it's usually large tracts of land. They make up about 30% of our total land area in the US, mostly out in the western states. And out of that, about a third is publicly owned, 2/3 are privately owned. So a lot of that privately owned land, we're grazing animals on it, but it's under a lot of pressure from developers who want to build houses, condos, all kinds of things like that. And there are conservation groups that are starting to pay ranchers to try to protect this rangeland so that it's a resource we can preserve. Then we have farmland, which is a little bit separate category because we're not just talking about grazing livestock. We may be talking about crops or smaller scale grazing pastures. So ranges are usually large areas. These might just be one small farm. And things like feedlots would usually fit more into this farmland category as well. We'll talk about all of those more when we start to get into agriculture. And then wetlands and coastlines we've already talked about quite a bit. So these are those transitions between land and water, and coastal or saltwater wetlands are super important because they provide food, protective habitats for lots of aquatic organisms. They also are the nurseries because a lot of organisms are going to breed there and raise their young there. And then they protect our coastlines from erosion, they improve our water quality, they reduce the damage from hurricanes and other types of flooding, and they're acting as buffers. So those are super important as well. Then we have our developed land in urban areas, which you already looked at in the chapter that you read about that over break. And then we have kind of everything else, our natural areas, those biomes that we talked about that don't really fit any of these categories. So you can see basically the makeup of our land resources and how they're represented. And you can see that a good portion of it, about a third, is this kind of unusable environment where we don't have a lot of ecosystem productivity. So that means that we really need to be careful to protect the rest of this so that we do have productive ecosystems that can form a very biodiverse and stable environment. So you also read a little bit about private versus government land ownership. If we take a look at the US, you see that more than half of our land is privately owned, and then most of the other let's say 40% or so is owned by the federal government, but there is a fair portion that is owned by individual states. And then the last small piece here is the tribal land that was granted to Native American. And you also read about how in that federal land we have some different types of preserves and wildlife refuges and the differences between those. Alright, so when we start looking at ecosystems and their importance to us, a lot of times what we notice, unfortunately, is that the most endangered ecosystems are also those that provide us with the most services. So this is a list of the top 22 most endangered ecosystems in the US. And I want you to notice that in there we have a lot of forests and we have a lot of grasslands. And forests and grasslands are where we're going to get most of our food and most of our products from. So this is a big problem. This is something that we don't want to continue doing. We also see some wetlands in there, and remember they act as our buffers. If you start looking at the world's forests, this dark green color is the original forest. amount on those continents about 8,000 years ago. And then the light green is how much we have now. So you can see that forests around the world are decreasing in size. And that means that we're not able to use those resources from them. And then this very middle green down the bottom, that one is basically the areas of the forest that we have not gotten to at all yet, we have not touched. So even though we have this remaining forest in that light green color, a lot of it has been altered in some way. So really the untouched part is showing us that total raw ecosystem that's still intact. And why do we care so much about forests? Well, remember, forests provide us with a tremendous amount of different resources, both in terms of services and actual goods that we get from them. So remember that they're an integral part of the water cycle, and they're helping to filter our water, and they also release it back up into the atmosphere when they transpire. They provide us with all sorts of goods that we can sell. They provide us with ecosystem services like clean air, clean water, making sure that our wildlife have enough resources for them, maintaining our biodiversity, cooling off the water, all sorts of things like that, cycling the nutrients. And then there's all of the things that we do in forests too, as well, like hiking and things like that, fishing along forested rivers. So they provide these ecological services or ecosystem services, and they also provide a lot of economic services. So our economy is really built on using these paper products or tree products. And if we didn't have the trees there, we wouldn't be able to do that. Now, when we look at all of the ecological services that they provide, they're reducing soil erosion by holding the soil in place with their roots. They're helping with water quality, as we've talked about before. They are cycling energy and nutrients through the food chains, through the different cycles, especially the carbon cycle. And remember, they're a really important carbon sink. So all of that carbon is being trapped by photosynthesis from the atmosphere. That CO2 gets taken in and it's trapped in these plant tissues. So if we start removing the plants and doing something with them, like burning them especially, we're going to start releasing a lot of that carbon back. So that can only cause even more of that greenhouse effect that we've talked about and contribute to climate change. So having these forests healthy and working for us as a carbon sink is very important. In addition, of very, very many things that we use every single day come from tree products. So even things that you wouldn't probably think of, like plastics and different chemicals, often come from trees. But also very important, think about the number of times a day you use different forms of paper. So not just the paper you write on, but also toilet paper, paper towels, all kinds of things like that, paper bags. So very, very important resource. And we can actually put dollar amounts on this. And this is just for one particular metro area, so one city and its suburbs. And you can see the huge amount of money that is saved basically by having trees. And these are just the public street trees. This isn't even a forested area, but they provide so many services. It's really significant. This chart is showing you in Tanzania how much the value is to the individual person, and every household actually, it says here that 3/4 of the total household income in Tanzania in this area are actually coming from either goods or services from this forest. So forests are incredibly important. And we want to make sure that we keep them up so that we can continue to use them. So some things that we want to try to avoid tend to be unsustainable practices like tree plantations, where they're growing a monoculture, all one species, the same tree. And remember, anytime you have a monoculture that's very low biodiversity, it's much more likely to be impacted if something happens, like a parasite disease comes along. It's also just not a good environment because you can't support a lot of different animals if you all have the same species. They might not feed on that one particular species. Unsustainable forestry tends to be associated with heavy pesticide use, and then you're killing off a lot of the organisms that would live there naturally, and it also could cause some water pollution issues. Clear cutting, we've talked about before. When you remove all the trees from the area, slash and burn would be a version of that where they're cutting down all the trees and then they will burn the whole area. That could be very detrimental to the ecosystem. So whenever they use these types of techniques, you tend to have a very slow recovery time. So succession, that secondary succession we talked about earlier in the year, that's going to happen slower. So it's going to take really long for the forest to recover from this type of logging or forestry. And this tends to be most common in developing areas because when you're trying to think about where your next meal comes from, you're not always going to be using the most sustainable techniques. We tend to be a little bit better at it in the more highly developed countries, but there are still companies that just don't care, or they're out to make a big buck. So that might still happen in the highly developed countries, but often not as much. So some of the techniques that we want to start looking at that are much more sustainable are going to require a lot of management. So that's why we have forest managers who will kind of take care of all these things and make sure that we are harvesting the trees that we need for our resources in a sustainable way. And that's really the goal, so that we have it for future generations. So this is much more sustainable if you have a polyculture. So you're growing different types of trees at once. You're replanting as you go so that you never really have to start from scratch. Succession is already in place. So some techniques that can help with this are selective cutting, where you're only removing certain mature trees at once and you're leaving the rest. Or shelter wood cutting, you leave the really big trees and you cut the smaller ones that are still mature enough to use so that they have this canopy to kind of shelter and protect them. This works particularly well with certain types of crops like the rubber trees and things like that. And then seed tree cutting means that you cut down the trees except you leave some that will be going to seed, so that these guys will drop their seeds and they'll basically replant the forest for you. So any of these methods can really help to maintain a sustainable forest. Also, using something called integrated pest management, or IPM, which we're going to talk about more later, but it's basically a variety of different techniques to minimize pests so that you don't have to use tons of pesticides. So pesticides are the last resort, and you can do all sorts of other things first to prevent having insects and parasites in your trees. And then also making sure you preserve wildlife corridors and that very important edge habitat. Snags, basically, this is another vocab word you should know, are kind of dead trees, and you'd think, okay, it's dead, why is that good? But they're really important habitat sites. So birds will nest in them, squirrels and things will live in them, bats might live in the hollow inside. So even though it's a dead tree, it's still very important to preserve things like that. And of course, preserving our riparian buffers so that our rivers are nice and healthy. Now, sustainable forestry might also include fire management, so doing things like prescribed burns, where you're burning out all of the undergrowth in an area, and you do that so that you prevent a larger fire that might take down the whole forest. So when we do these things, we can continue to harvest trees from the forest, and we can do it in a way that's not having as big of an impact. And one of those big impacts that we can prevent is having a really negative effect on the carbon cycle. So if we use this reduced impact logging techniques, we can really decrease the amount of CO2 that's being produced from taking out those trees and from logging this area. Alright, so if we look at deforestation throughout the world, there are two major areas that are under stress: tropical forests and boreal forests. And with the tropical forest, it could be a wet forest or a dry forest that's under stress. So our rainforests are any of these areas where we have high precipitation, and then our dry forests are those areas that are going to have a very dry season, and those trees are going to be dormant for a while then. Now, there's a bunch of things that kind of lead into this, and some of that is when we increase our population, that means we need to make more food, and we need to have land to do it. So a lot of these forests are cleared in order to do that, and one particular connection to that is something called subsistence agriculture, which is basically when someone's trying to produce enough food for their family to get by. That's subsistence. So a lot of these areas of forests are just being cleared in order to grow enough food to feed your family. But also there there are some government policies that can favor deforestation. So the Brazilian government if you look at the Amazon beginning in the late 1950s, started to build this big highway through the Amazon basement. And by putting that road in, now you opened up that area for deforestation. So a lot of their policies have kind of led to the deforestation of this certain area. Also, if you really can get a lot of money for your agriculture exports, then there's going to be an incentive to try to clear out the forests to make the money. Mining, dam construction, taking that food and burning it, or the wood and burning it, those can all contribute to deforestation. In some places, that is their main energy source. And then, of course, commercial logging, which is what we tend to think about. In boreal forests, most of that impact is due to commercial logging. And they're also starting to disappear, or not disappear so much as shift their locations because of things like climate change. But these are the major areas where we have boreal forests in the world, and they're going to be mostly in that uppermost part of the northern hemisphere. And they support a variety of coniferous evergreens, and all of these are very useful to us in terms of wood and wood fiber to make things like paper and all those other products you saw. So this is our world's largest biome. It makes up 11% of our total world land area, but there have been lots of contention of whether or not we should be using this resource and how to use this resource responsibly. So actually in 2010, logging companies and environmental groups decided to suspend logging in 116,000 square miles of Canadian forests, and you can see how much is actually there. So that sounds like a small amount, but that's still an area the size of Great Britain. And they also, in that time period, designated 149,000 square miles to be used for sustainable logging. So there's a lot of different policies that are starting to come about with this. How do we use this responsibly? And you can see that certain countries, especially Canada, really depend on this resource. This is one of their largest resources. It's one of their largest ways to make money. So their whole economy is dependent on that. There's one particular case study you should know about in the US, and that's the Tongass National Forest in Alaska. So it is one of our largest ecosystems, and it's 17 million acres. It's the wettest place in the US. So it is a temperate rainforest, even though you don't think of Alaska as being very warm. It is on our southernmost part of Alaska, so that helps to keep it a little warmer, and that moisture supports a huge old growth forest where the trees are up to 700 years old. This is a climax community, so we have a very productive ecosystem here, and a lot of these organisms depend on it, and we in turn depend on them. A lot of the native tribes traditionally eat the salmon, the sitka deer that live here, so they're very dependent. 70% of this forest has been logged because these old growth trees provide a very high yield of wood and other things, and it's very much the basis of the local economy. The problem is it's very slow to regenerate because they are hundreds of years old, and the logging operations are also very expensive in this area. So you can see it's basically this whole little arm of Alaska that comes down here, anywhere in the green, and there's been a series of different laws going back and forth over time in this area because they can't agree on how to manage it responsibly. So you don't need to write down every single one of these, but you need to know basically that we keep kind of switching back and forth between how we're going to manage this area. So originally this was locally logged, mostly hand logged, and then in the 1950s you had two major pulp mill companies that came in, received a 50-year contract, received government subsidies, and basically they conspired together to drive log prices down. They put smaller logging operations out of business. They became major polluters in the area. In addition, they eventually wound up having their subsidies taken away. So that didn't happen until quite some time later. But at that point, they had basically owned all of the Tongass between the two companies. A 1974 lawsuit against them almost halted all clear cutting in the US, but it got overturned in 1976. Over half of all that old growth timber in the Tongass was removed by this 1990 act. Then you can see since then, the government has been trying to log it. It's kind of switched back and forth. It is very expensive for the government to log it itself, so you have a lot of contractors coming in to do that. And one of the most controversial things has been whether or not we should be able to build roads in this area. So that has gone back and forth quite a bit. And right now, we are in a place where technically this roadless area conservation rule is intact, where you can't build any new roads into these wilderness areas. However, there are 3 parts of this Tongass area that are kind of exempt from it so that they can still log it. So these can be very contentious, is how do we use these resources wisely? Alright, now we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to go from talking about our forests to talking about something that's supporting not only the forests, but all of our different types of ecosystem, and that would be our soils. So this is really the kind of the basis for land use, because the soil type is going to determine the ecosystem type. And when we start looking at soils, we notice that there are almost half water and air that are going to be percolating and seeping through, and the other half is a combination of mineral matter and organic matter. So we're going to focus today on these minerals, and then later we'll get to the composition of the soil as a whole. So minerals are non-renewable resources because they're not going to be regenerated in our lifetimes, but they're elements or compounds that can occur naturally in the Earth's crust, and they're unique in that they're pure. So if they're an element or a pure compound, they qualify as a mineral. So things like copper, iron, platinum, mercury, manganese, titanium, those are all minerals. Rocks are a mix of those. So you have a rock, you have multiple different minerals that are all kind of compacted together. And an ore, anybody who's ever played Minecraft knows that you can get a mineral out of an ore. So it's a rock that has a large concentration of one particular mineral, so these ores are going to be collected and then mined. They're going to be mined, and then the mineral is going to be extracted from that ore. There are also several geologic processes that you need to know here. So you should hopefully have encountered these at some point in your education, but remember that weathering is any time we break down rocks. So breaking it down into soil or sediment, that would be weathering. Erosion is carrying it away, moving it from place to place, and then once it is eroded, it will be deposited somewhere. So that's the deposition part. So that's when it's kind of dropped off in another place. Now there are lots of different factors that affect weathering and erosion, but this is going to be really important to talking about soil, because when we weather rock, which is our parent material in our soil, that's what allows those soils to form in the first place. So weathering happens through biological processes with living things, through chemical processes, chemical reactions breaking it down, and also through physically breaking rock. So all of these different things are involved. There are different organisms that are basically forming acids in the environment that break it down. Tiny cracks are made, and water will seep into them and freeze and expand and cause parts to break off. Those plants are able to grow in the cracks, and the roots help to push them further apart. The topography of the environment is also going to affect the amount of weathering and erosion. If you have a very steep slope, you're going to have a lot more erosion. The rock is going to be very exposed there to the different things that could cause weathering, and then once it's exposed, it's going to be carried off by wind, water, and all of our other elements there. Also, human activities are going to have a big impact on weathering and erosion as well. Alright, so when we look at how rocks form, we want to look at the rock cycle. So we have 3 different types of rocks, and they basically can go through a very slow chemical cycle to transform into the different types. So you have basically this version of the rock cycle that I gave you, but it may help to actually put these labels onto your rock cycle, because these are kind of the overall things of what's happening here. So this sediments part is really kind of in between any of these other ones, but the important thing to recognize here is that any of these types of rocks can wind up turning into the other type. So it's not like once they're igneous, they're going to stay that way forever. It doesn't. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about these different types of rocks. So the first type is an igneous rock, and these are forming from cooling molten magma or lava, and as it cools, it crystallizes. So if the is above ground, that's what makes it lava. These are going to be called extrusive igneous rocks, and because these cool very quickly, they're going to form small or no crystals. Intrusive igneous rocks are going to be from magma cooling underneath the surface, and because they cool very slowly, they can develop these very large and beautiful crystals. Then we have sedimentary rocks, which are formed from sediments, given their name. And we have two ways that this can happen. If they're chemical sedimentary rocks, then they are coming from minerals that are in the water. So the water evaporates and it leaves behind these minerals. If they are clastic sedimentary rocks, which is probably more common, then these are being eroded into sediments. You have other rocks that erode and then get deposited in a certain area, and then they are compacted by lots of pressure and cemented together over time. There's some chemical reactions that go into that to get a clastic sedimentary rock. So you can see some examples of each of those. And it could be mud, it could be sand, it could be pebbles, it could be anything that gets kind of compacted and cemented together into a rock will give you one of these sedimentary rocks. And you can often see the little particles of sediment that are in them. Then metamorphic rocks are going to form under very intense heat and pressure. So they could start as any other type of rock, and then the more heat and the more pressure they get, the different properties you wind up with as a result. So actually, even if we're starting with the same type of rock, if we apply more heat and pressure, it will change into different things, which is what you're seeing here. So there's two types of metamorphism. There's contact metamorphism and regional metamorphism. And contact metamorphism occurs when you have magma coming up into a certain area of rock, and as that magma rises, it's going to increase the temperature in the surrounding rock. It's also going to be pressing out on it, so that increased temperature and pressure can change the rock type, and it can become a contact metamorphic rock. Then we have regional metamorphism, which is usually involving our tectonic plate boundaries. So in an area like, for instance, this is a convergent boundary, you're going to have regional metamorphism here where these plates are colliding. It's going to be over a large area, and because the plates are colliding, you get this large heat and pressure that changes the type of rock you can find there. So these are some common metamorphic rocks, and you can see the parent rock that they came from. So here's an igneous rock that turned into a metamorphic rock, sedimentary rocks that turned into metamorphic rocks, and then, as we said before, these metamorphic rocks can actually turn into other types of metamorphic rocks as well. So this all comes back to this kind of rock cycle. This is how we can go from one to the other. So be prepared to come in next time and talk about this rock cycle and kind of work it out. And then we'll start to talk about, okay, now that we have these rocks, how do we get them out of the ground? So that'll lead us into mining. And then if they're in the ground and they're weathering, how do we get these sediments, and why are soils so important? So that's kind of where we're going from here. All right, I'll see you next class. Please have these with you to be checked. Good night.